He was just a janitor, but he caught a fatal medical error in time. The sentence hangs like a flashbulb in a dark hallway. A man pushing a cart, moving between rooms most people never notice, becomes the hinge between life and something much worse. The city hums outside, sirens wavering into the night, a stray cab idling beneath a sodium street lamp. But inside the hospital, the world is quieter, smaller, and full of the tiny decisions that decide who lives to see sunrise. Carlos Menddees knew those corridors as if they were a second neighborhood. He could find the supply closet with his eyes closed. He knew which exit door stuck in the winter and where the warm vending machine habitually gave an extra packet of sugar. He learned the rhythm of the night shift, the slow, patient sweep of nurses' footsteps, the soft coughs from behind closed doors, the high, occasional scrape of a gurney across linoleum. He learned how to make himself small enough to be ignored and careful enough to be trusted for the little things that never made headlines. On a rainy Tuesday at 2:12 a.m., he smelled something wrong before he saw it, a chemical tang that didn't belong in the antiseptic air, a sharpness that pulled at the edges of his attention. He had stood in this lobby 1,000 nights and cataloged 1,000 smells. Tonight, the hospital smelled of hurry, like someone had forgotten how to breathe. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from right now. He came to this city a decade earlier with a single suitcase and a photograph folded inside his wallet, a mother smiling with a cloth over her hair, 2 younger sisters squeezed at her side. The photograph fit in a palm, and for years it was all his summer and all his holiday. Guatemala had been a campsite of memories he both loved and left. He left because there was work here, dishwasher steam and janitor carts, instead of long queues and uncertain pay. He left because his sister needed a tuition payment and his mother could not wait. He left because he believed in the small, honest work that adds up. The janitor job was never meant to make him invisible. He liked to think of it as a kind of service, cleaning what illness made messy, smoothing edges so others could heal. He woke late, ate in the kitchen of a modest third-floor apartment, and caught the night bus to the hospital, a thermos with coffee cooling in his hands. His cart was his armor, a battered orange container with buckets, rags, a roll of tape, a stack of folded linens, and a little tin where he kept his numbers, phone numbers for family, and a note with the address of a small storefront he hoped to one day rent. When he had a spare shift and extra savings, he dreamed about counters and chairs, about making empanadas and small cups of coffee for nurses who had too many nights like this one. He was careful with the way he hustled, a nod for the night nurse who always smelled faintly of cigarettes and lavender.
A small joke for the doctor who kept his keys on a carabiner and forgot to return them. He learned to be useful without being intrusive. He learned the touch of the place, a light that flickered in Wing B, a squeaky wheel on Bed 12's gurney, the patient who always pressed the call button at 1:07 a.m. He learned the names of the cleaners who came 3 nights a week and the orderlies who rolled through at dawn. Tonight, though, something broke that quiet knowledge. A sound, a glance, a misalignment at the usual choreography. These are the things that catch a person. A nurse's hurried voice clipped short, a medic pushing a tray too fast, a bag in the wrong hand. He'd never thought of himself as someone who noticed mistakes. But noticing is what invisible people do well. You spend your life seeing the details others do not, because those details are the work. The patient in room 406 was an older man with a daughter who sat by the bed, hands threaded between blankets. The daughter hummed a hymn under her breath, eyes red and tired. At first, Carlos only passed the doorway, the cart's wheel whispering along the linoleum. He adjusted a towel on a nearby chair. He straightened a pillowcase, small things. He liked performing small acts of care for strangers. That was part of his quiet dignity. Then a nurse came in with a tray. She was a young woman, shoulders tight with fatigue, hair dropped in a careless knot, her badge read in Ortiz. Her face had the look of someone running on a few hours and too many tasks. On the tray were vials and a syringe that glinted in the fluorescent light. Labels clung to small glass like stickers on a suitcase, tiny, easy to miss. The daughter looked up and smiled because she trusted everyone in the white coats. Trust was thick in these halls. Trust is part of why families slept across chairs, why they'd watch a monitor and believe the name on the chart matched the name in the bed. Carlos watched the nurse's hands. He watched the tray's angle as she set it down. He watched the nurse turn briefly to the computer at the workstation, and in that half second, something in his mouth tightened. Not fear exactly, but an attention so sudden it was sharp as a blade. His fingers curled around his broom handle. He thought of the photograph in his wallet and the list of his sister's school fees. He remembered a child in a park a week ago, holding a balloon, and one of the strings snapping. The child's cry was a small, instant grief. He felt that same small grief rising now for a stranger he had never met. Rules are rules. He knew them. Cleaners do not interfere. Do not touch medical trays. Cleaners clean. Staff, staff. There were signs and trainings and stern faces in meetings where the janitors were given time slots and told to keep to them.
Yet, there are moments when rules arrive with the morning coffee, drinks and polite conversation, and other moments when rules push like a door you must step through because something is on fire behind it. He remembered his mother's hands, calloused and hard-working, pressing tortillas into a pan, pressing a life into shape. He remembered her telling him, "Cuando veas algo mal, diles la verdad." When you see something wrong, tell the truth. The words had weight. In that instant, with the vials and the tray and a daughter humming, that weight turned into a choice. He stepped closer in a way that made his presence noticed but didn't announce him. "Excuse me," he said, in a voice thin with the night. The nurse startled. You could see worry etch across her face like a map. She blinked, turned, smiled because he was a familiar face. He didn't plan his words, only the small, blunt truth. "I think that's not for this patient." The nurse's mouth narrowed. The hospital's rhythm stuttered for a fraction. She answered in a tone between apology and annoyance. "Everything's fine, Carlos. We're busy." And there it was, the language of pressure. "We're busy. Do not slow the flow." But Carlos already knew there was something else. The label looked wrong, a word misaligned, a syringe oriented as if it belonged at a different bedside. "Hold on," Carlos said. "That name, the chart, it's different." The nurse glanced at the computer, fingers jittering across keys. A monitor beeped, a pulse blinking on a screen down the hall. The daughter hummed and smoothed a blanket. For a moment, the world became only faces and labels, nothing else mattering. The nurse's eyes returned to the tray. She swallowed. "I'm the janitor," Carlos said, and it was not a claim, but a way to explain why he had no right and yet felt compelled. "But I worked here long enough to remember faces of beds. That one," he pointed at a small sticker near the vial. The nurse's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the syringe. If a medical error is a complicated thing, an accumulation of small lapses, an overworked staff, a mislabeled tray, someone moving too fast, then preventing one is often more simple and more fragile. A single person who refuses to be invisible for one heartbeat. In that hallway, with the fluorescent bulbs humming and the carpet's antiseptic smell filling his nose, Carlos made that refusal. He insisted, she argued. A passing doctor rounded the corner and saw the exchange. He glanced, annoyed at the delay. "Is there a problem?" he asked, voice sharp. Carlos knew what the question meant. "What are you doing?" A janitor interfering is a breach. Interference is a ripple in the professional order. The doctor looked at the nurse, at the tray, at the patient. The nurse assured him that they'd double-check the orders. The doctor nodded with the authority that closes debate. "Proceed," he said, and stepped away, leaving a thin thread of tension suspended in the air.
Carlos did not stand down. His chest thudded like a trapped bird. He thought of the child in the balloons park, of his mother telling him to speak the truth. He thought perhaps of a different life, where he might have become invisible by choice. His hand reached out and rested on the small of the tray, as if to slow it. "Please," he said again, and the word came out smaller than he wanted. That single touch was the thing that split the night's flow. The nurse jerked the tray back, surprised at the contact. The doctor turned quickly, and the daughter in the bed looked up, some thread of fear unraveling from the corners of her eyes. In that breath, someone pushed a button at the nurse's station. A red light blinked, and the world tightened. What followed was not a hero cinematic rush. There was no triumphant choir. There was a cluster of hurried murmurs, and the smell of antiseptic, and the sound of tours of duty intensifying. Medical staff swarmed, voices overlapping like bad radio. The nurse, cheeks flushed, explained hurriedly about a mix-up. An extra tray had been placed from another patient's chart. A label had been switched, she said, maybe while moving trays from one room to another. There was the word mistake, small, and the word fast, small too. They adjusted the paperwork. They checked the wristband. The daughter cried once, a small stifled sound. Carlos felt his heart finally start to slow. He could have faded back into the background then, allowed his cart to hum forward, and let the machine of hospital care reassert a kind of order. He didn't. Not because he wanted recognition, but because he had touched a thin, raw place in the world and could not unfeel it. Later, when others would name it courage, in that moment he felt only the light, terrible awareness of what might have happened. He saw a space where a family's night could have ended in grief. He saw a picture of his mother, and all the small, unsung truths of his life bubbled up. He had broken rule. He had spoken up. He had interrupted procedure. The consequences of those things were known to everyone with a job title that required protocol. Word of the incident traveled along the hospital's veins the way gossip always does, whispered in the break room over coffee, repeated in the laundry room as a grim joke, turned into a cautionary watch-out by a nurse who had been reprimanded before for wasting time. Carlos returned to his cart. He felt the evening's cold like a shy animal rubbing against his shins. The hospital lurched back into habit, as if nothing had happened and everything had happened all at once. The next morning, at shift change, someone from administrative called him in. A woman in a navy blazer with a badge and perfect hair sat behind a desk that held nothing but a tidy stack of papers and a screen. Her smile was careful. "We appreciate your vigilance, Mr. Menddees," she said, and the phrase had the cool of an air-conditioned room. "But we have policies."
A reprimand is a paper thing. It is smaller than an injury and larger than a hurt. The paper said he had breached protocol by interfering in a clinical process. It told him he would be suspended pending review. He sat in a chair that was too small for him and watched his name on a form. His forearms, which had pushed a cart for years and folded linens and wiped the faces of ever-changing rooms, felt suddenly like the arms of someone who had crossed into a space where his name was not welcome. "There are procedures," the woman repeated, and her voice was a textbook of rules. "We have to protect patient safety. We cannot allow unauthorized interference." Carlos tried to explain. He tried to say that he had seen a label that didn't match a chart. He tried to say that he had spoken because a family was at stake. But words like authority and protocol moved like walls. They had a solidity that made feelings seem soft and impractical. He wrote his acknowledgement, signed where told, and then walked out into the late morning light that felt suddenly too bright for his eyes. People who live unseen carry their visibility like a weight when it appears. For Carlos, a suspension meant more than a day off. It meant rent unpaid, and his sister's tuition at risk, and the shrinking of the possibility of his storefront dream. It meant the quiet humiliation of being treated as if he had committed an offense for doing what felt like right. It stung in the belly, that mix of shame and righteous stubbornness you only carry if you have ever cleaned a floor and watched a child smile because the room was tidy. He did not know, as he sat on the curb outside the hospital, that an elderly nurse in the next corridor had leaned out into the hall and with trembling hands pulled her phone from her pocket. She had recorded the scene, at first only for herself, a kind of private witness to something she felt mattered. Her hands shook as she panned from the tray to the nurse's face to Carlos's. The footage lasted 36 seconds. It was not cinematic. It was raw and shaky and unremarkable, much like the people it showed. Someone else, always someone else, caught the short clip and sent it to a colleague, and the colleague sent it to a friend, and the friend sent it to a page that reposted stories of the city's unsung workers. The clip made it to a phone held by someone whose thumb slipped and accidentally shared it on a public platform. In an era where attention is currency, that small private video found a market. On the street, Carlos smoked a cigarette he did not want because it steadied him, and the city moved around him. He thought of asking the security guard inside for the footage, for an apology, anything that might reverse the paper's weight. He had no sense that the internet was about to pick him up like a breeze picks up ash and toss him into a storm.
It started small, a handful of comments, a replay, a "thank you for speaking up here," a "how brave" there. The clip's title, "Janitor Stops Mix-Up, Saves Patient," was simple and blunt. Within hours it had been seen by people who did not know this hospital, did not know the routine of the night shift, and did not know Carlos Menddees at all. They saw only the moment an ordinary man stepped into someone else's space and did what his conscience demanded. The public's reaction did something that the hospital's forms could not. It translated an act into a story that others could read and feel something about. Messages arrived on Carlos's phone, numbers he did not recognize, telling him he had done the right thing, offering prayers, offering money for his missed shifts. The hospital's email inbox filled with questions. An online forum debated the sanctity of protocol. A local blogger called for the hospital to reconsider punitive action against employees who speak up. The clip went from a few hundred views to thousands. And yet, in those first hours, all of that was another kind of noise. Carlos sat on his cot that night, the card he used for the bus pressed between the pages of his Bible, the photograph of his family warm in his wallet. He had not acted for praise. The woman's tied hair, the daughter's thin smile, and the misread label were enough to ask for courage. He had acted because the night had asked him to. He slept fitfully, dreams full of fluorescent light and the smell of bleach. News moves faster than bureaucracies. Management's letter remained on his file. The suspension was on paper. The public's compassion was in pixels. Neither rescinded the other that night. But when something private is published, it changes the terms on which institutions respond. The hospital had to acknowledge the clip. They had to send a statement that used careful language. "We are reviewing the matter," it said, "and we cannot comment on personnel matters." The administration's words were designed to be neuter, stable, words that do not leak. Carlos opened his phone the next morning to an inbox that vibrated like an insect. Messages with hearts, dollars, offers of help. A local community group reached out offering a small fundraiser. A neighbor he had known in the building for years dropped an envelope with cash and a note that read, in careful block letters, "Gracias. Please drink coffee on us." The world was, in its small way, changing the script for him in a fashion his suspension had not prepared him for. He did not refuse assistance. He sat at his kitchen table and unfolded the bills like someone deciphering a map.
Each note was a story of its own. A nurse who had been at the hospital that night calling to say she had seen what he did and that she too had been afraid to speak. A college student who had watched the clip and wanted to help him with rent. A former patient who had been touched by the honesty of the scene and sent a message remembering his mother. The money would cover bills and groceries for a few weeks. It would not fix every consequence, but it was something like a bridge. In the hospital, the staff shifted on a different axis now. Some looked at him with gratitude, others with caution. The nurse who had been at the center of the mix-up returned to work after a day's leave and avoided Carlos's gaze. Management sent out a memo about reporting concerns through proper channels and recirculated a training video that emphasized the chain of command. The hospital was balancing two forces, the need to preserve order and the tidal pull of public attention. Institutions, like people, prefer certainty. They do not like to have their rules elbowed by a stranger on a night with a tray and a trembling hand. There was another knock at Carlos's door 3 days later. It was a woman who introduced herself as a volunteer for a neighborhood group. She brought a casserole and a thermos of coffee. Her eyes were wet when she spoke. "My sister watched the video," she said. "She told me she had seen someone like you when she was in hospital, and nobody listened. We wanted to say thank you." Thank you had become a small currency in itself, exchanged by people who had seen an ordinary man do an ordinary brave thing. The casserole left a warm wedge in Carlos's chest. He ate slowly. He thought about how he wanted to spend the donated money, on rent, on the storefront, and then paused, imagining a different use. What if his small business, when it opened, offered free meals for night shift workers? What if the counter could be a small piece of restitution for all the nights he had been unseen? He liked the idea because it fit the quiet way he lived. Not flashy, not grand, just practical kindness. But before any of that could happen, other things were beginning to move. The video had reached a local reporter who wanted to speak with him. A television crew called, asking to film from the outside of his building. The hospital's legal team prepared a statement and asked for time to review personnel policies before any action was taken. Social media's buzz raised a question louder than any form. When someone breaks protocol to save a life, who decides whether they are punished or praised? Carlos tried to answer in the only way he knew, by making lists. He made a list of phone numbers to call, of small payments to accept, of people to thank. He made a list of things the storefront would need, and a second list of the nights he would cover when he was back at work. There was a calm in lists, an illusion of control.
The city outside his window was a photograph in motion. Buses rumbling, lights winking on, a man shouting at a dog across the street. The world continued, whether institutions retracted suspensions or not. And then the first direct consequence arrived, an email from the hospital's Human Resources Department asking him to attend a meeting to discuss the incident. He went because he had to. The office smelled like lemon cleaner and printer ink. A man in a suit, with the kind of eyes that make calculus look like a confession, sat opposite him. The questions were procedural, tight. What happened? Why did you intervene? Did you understand the risk of interfering with patient care? Carlos answered plainly. I saw a mismatch, and I stopped it. My conscience would not let me walk away. He told them what his mother had taught him, because sometimes people who ask you to explain yourself do not understand a life until you make them hear a single small memory. They documented his words and told him there would be an investigation. The word investigation has a weight different than thank you, and it settled in Carlos's stomach like a stone. After the meeting, he left with a printed copy of a new policy that seemed designed for a world in which people never spoke out of turn. He kept the paper folded in his wallet like a second photograph, and before he slept, he prayed briefly in the language of his mother. If this were a different kind of story, the next beat would quickly bind into praise and medals and an immediate reinstatement. But stories are rarely so tidy. Things did start to tilt, though, slowly. The news piece aired with a voiceover that called him an unlikely hero, and a photo of the tray flickered on the screen. The clip was reposted hundreds of thousands of times. People who had never been inside that hospital wrote letters. A small online fundraiser raised more than Carlos expected in a few days. The money was not the point to him, but what surprised him even more was how quickly strangers felt they knew him by a 36-second video, how quickly they felt entitled to say what he had done meant. He began to speak with reporters, careful at first, then a little more natural, because his voice when he told the story did not belong to a man fighting for a storefront. It belonged to someone who wanted to remind others that people who keep hospitals running are not invisible. He spoke in simple phrases about work ethic and family and the photograph in his wallet. He spoke about the little, respectable dream of a counter and a hot cup of coffee he could call his own. When cameras trained on his hands, people noticed the stains of a life lived in practical labor, a small scar on his knuckle, a line of a callus where a mop handle had rubbed. They are the hands of someone who has touched the fundamentals of every one of our lives: floors, linens, the objects we use when we are at our weakest.
But even as the public began to lift him up, there were other undercurrents. Staff whispers became louder in some wings. The hospital circulated memorandums about boundaries. A few doctors grumbled about precedents. The nurse who had been at the center of the mix-up took an extra-long leave and then left the hospital for a position across town. There are always consequences that do not make the news. People shifting, choosing silence, moving away from the place where a mistake was almost catastrophic. Carlos felt the subtle, human cost. The staff's eyes that had once been friendly now glanced away. A few colleagues avoided riding the elevator with him. At night, alone in his apartment, he turned the photograph over in his hands. On the back, his mother had written a date in faded ink, the day his youngest sister was born. He thought about the way people use visible moments to rewrite their stories. A clip of 36 seconds had become the map by which others now judged his life. It felt strange and a little precarious. He did not ask for a video. He had only done what he thought was right. Then, the thing that often separates an incident from a movement happened. Someone started a hashtag, invisible but important, and it took off. It became more than a slogan. It grew into a chorus of others telling brief, aching stories of being unseen. The night porter whose lamp fixed a failed ventilator cable in the nick of time. The cafeteria worker who noticed a child wandering alone and called security. The maintenance man who found a cracked ceiling tile before it fell. The hashtag was a net thrown into the ocean of small acts, and it caught many fish. People shared names and photos and small private thanks. The viral nature of the story created its own ecosystem, and in that ecosystem, Carlos was a center that others gravitated toward, not because he asked, but because his story echoed theirs. And yet, as momentum turned into attention, Carlos found himself pulled into a web of small, often contradictory pressures. Well-wishers sent messages and flowers, and an older man from the neighborhood stopped by with a newspaper clipping about a plaque unveiled for a janitor in a different city. The hospital sent a formal notice that the suspension would remain during policy review. A lawyer's voice on the phone suggested caution when speaking to reporters. A stranger sent a private message with an offer. If Carlos could collect enough money, perhaps his store could open earlier than planned. It was all possibility and paperwork, blessing and barrier shot through equally. One night, nearing the end of the week, Carlos returned to the hospital to do an extra shift. He wanted to see the place where everything had happened, to check faces and find the nurse who had recorded the clip. He pushed his cart down the corridor with hands that trembled just a little. He passed room 406 and looked in. The daughter was there and smiled when she saw him.
She said little. Words were not necessary, but she reached up and gripped his hand for a moment, as if to say, in the way people speak with fingers, "I saw you." That grip was a small anchoring point. It kept him steady in a world suddenly full of voices. In the corridor, a nurse who had been reticent before lifted her head and spoke his name, this time without the hesitation of someone weighing protocol against a story. Another cleaner pushed her cart past and gave him a nod that was more than a greeting. It was recognition. The hospital, like cities, is a place of overlapping worlds, some rough with friction, others warm with connection. Just as he felt the ground start to fit under his feet again, something else shifted. The clip, which had been shared and reshared, reached a person who amplified it in a different direction. A politician looking for a cause, a community organizer looking for visibility, a television host looking for stories of the everyday turned noble. The hospital received calls, and the hospital's public relations team drafted language meant to soothe public concern while protecting institutional interests. A local community center called to ask about organizing a fundraiser, and a high school class invited Carlos to speak. He accepted hesitantly, not because he wanted to be a public figure, but because he wanted the story to be about more than him. He wanted it to be about the eyes that ignored cleaners and the hands that reached for trays. On a cold Thursday morning, an email from Human Resources arrived with an invitation to a reconciliation meeting. The header was careful, the content more so. The meeting promised clarity and discussion of role boundaries. Carlos agreed. He went in with a blue pen and a folded list of what he needed, his job back, the chance to explain the small photograph and the list of store supplies. He carried with him a quiet intention to protect the dignity of work and to push, in a gentle way, for small changes that might keep others from standing in the space where he had stood. He did not know, as he sat waiting, that the video was still moving across networks. That night, a late-night show would play a clip and ask people to call in. The show would play his face on loop, a man caught between a reprimand and an outpouring of gratitude. It was dizzying and felt oddly abstract, his life turning into a series of frames on someone else's stage. Inside the meeting room, the administrators were soft, and their faces practiced neutrality. They mentioned patient safety, protocols, good faith reporting, and the importance of boundaries. They placed a heavy emphasis on training and on proper reporting channels. Carlos listened and folded the paper with his blue pen into neat creases. He explained, again, the exact color of the label, the way the vial sat, the trembling of a daughter's hand on a blanket. People listened because 100,000 strangers had leaned in.
In the room, there was a tension between the cold language of policy and the hot, simple truth of the night's event. That tension remained unresolved as the meeting ended. When he left, the world outside had the indifferent cheer of a city that refuses to stop. A woman selling coffee called out to him in Spanish from across the street, and he bought a cup without thinking much about it. He sipped slowly. The cup warmed his palms. He had not resolved anything. The hospital's suspension still sat in a folder. The public chatter still rippled. But there was a softening in the way some people looked at him now, an acknowledgement that what he had done belonged to a kind of moral currency that could not be printed on policy paper. That week, as the media cycles turned and turned again, a stranger donated a sum large enough to cover his rent and his sister's tuition for a few months. Another group offered to help set up the small storefront he had been planning. People he had never met sent messages that said, in various forms, "We see you." The words were small and huge at once. They touched him like hands. Yet, in the same hour that kindness arrived, there were murmurs that unsettled him. A few comments online said he had overstepped, that protocol exists for a reason, that systems protect patients. Others accused him of seeking fame. These voices were of a different kind, skeptical, ready to weaponize the language of procedure against the language of conscience. Carlos sat with that noise too, because visibility, when it arrives suddenly, brings with it both praise and scrutiny. It makes your life a place where strangers feel they can speak with certainty about your motives. On a narrow Friday evening, as the sun bled down behind the hospital towers and the city lit itself in 1,000 small bulbs, a camera crew came to his block. They filmed him coming out of the building, his cart left in the supply room, his hands ink-stained from a pen. He gave a brief interview, speaking slowly because he wanted the words to carry. He did not speak of heroism, though the world would label him that. He spoke about small things, the dignity of honest labor, the value of speaking up for other people's lives, the fact that all of us carry the possibility of noticing. He did not say everything. He did not say that he sometimes worried he had endangered his livelihood. He did not say that he sometimes imagined what it would mean if he never found the storefront he dreamed of. He spoke about seeing the invisible as an act of respect, and about the way the night taught him to listen. And then, a new element that no one could have predicted rippled through the pattern. A user on a social platform uploaded the hospital's security footage, unedited, raw, showing the full sequence of that night. It contained angles that the shaky nurses clip did not, and in those extra seconds there were faces and gestures that added nuance.
For some viewers, the raw footage was confirmation. Carlos had acted right. For others, it raised questions about chain of command and the fragile choreography of care. The hospital issued a short statement insisting on ongoing review and asked the public to withhold judgment. The City Council's Health Committee asked for a copy of the footage. The nurse who had been the focus of early critique posted a message apologizing for the error and explaining the pressure of her shift. The hospital's PR asked Carlos not to speak to the press for the time being, citing ongoing internal processes. He agreed, not out of fear, but because he wanted his actions to be about the bigger issue rather than himself. That night, in the quiet, the city breathed out. Carlos sat at his small kitchen table and wrote down the names of people who had reached out to him and wanted to help with a plan for a cafe. Names of carpenters, a friend who could design a logo, somebody who could teach him how to make the coffee right. He placed the folded training policy into his wallet next to his mother's photograph. It felt, in a small way, like balancing two weights. He wanted to build, to return to work, to be present with his family. He wanted to make sure others would not have to step into the space he had stepped into alone. And as the week closed, a new tension entered the narrative. The hospital said they would temporarily maintain his suspension pending investigation. The word flew across the city, picked up by commentators who framed it as either necessary caution or an injustice. The public conversation hardened into factions, those defending protocol, those defending conscience. Carlos read some of the forums, the good and the ugly, and felt both honored and exposed. He read the kind messages and the cruel ones. He read strangers arguing about what courage looked like in policy speak, and he felt like a man standing at a window watching weather pass. Sun, then storm, then clear, all within the same hour. In the quiet of his apartment, he tried to sort them into piles: gratitude, doubt, obligation. None of the piles made the signature on the suspension paper go away. None of them paid rent. But they rearranged the world around him, and in that rearranged light, people he had passed in the hallways now saw him differently. Then something happened that made the story shift from viral moment to real consequence. A local nonprofit that supported night workers and hospital staff reached out to offer legal guidance and to advocate for a formal review of the hospital's policies on staff reporting. A city council member who had seen the video publicly called for clearer protections for employees who flag safety concerns. The hospital, which had initially fallen back on the language of policy and ongoing review, found itself under pressure not only from commentators but from institutional peers, asking how they would prevent such a near miss in the future.
The strain on the hospital's public relations office was visible in the slow, careful statements they released. They thanked staff for their diligence and emphasized patient safety and protocol adherence. But they also announced an internal review into the chain of custody of medication trays on busy shifts. It was the kind of language institutions use when the facts are heavy and the cameras are bright. The language of process, which implies change without promising drama. For Carlos, however, change did not need to be revolutionary. He wanted two simple things: to be allowed back to work, and for the hospital to make it easier for staff at every level to speak up when something seemed wrong. A turning point arrived first in the quiet. An apology from the young nurse who had been at the center of the mix-up. She reached out through an intermediary, voice small and raw as paper. She did not ask for absolution. She told him she had been working double shifts, that she had meant no harm, and that she had been frightened when the error came to light. She said she would testify that his intervention had likely prevented a catastrophic outcome. Her note was a small bridge. It did not erase the rebuke on his file, but it softened the space between him and others, and it allowed him to see the event as less like a trial and more like a collision between exhaustion and responsibility. Public support swelled into something more organized. A crowdfunding page, started by a neighbor inspired by the clip, raised more than enough money to cover his rent and his sister's tuition for months. It also raised a surplus that a local community group asked Carlos if he would let them use to build something communal. He hesitated. He had dreamed of the storefront for years, a modest place with a worn countertop, a name written in hand lettering, and empanadas steaming in the morning. But the surplus gave him a new option, to make the dream into a shared thing, something that might feed the loneliness of night workers as well as his family. At a city hearing about worker protections, the patient from room 406's daughter stood up and told a room full of officials that a man she had never meant to meet had saved her father's life. She did not use dramatic words. She spoke in a steady voice that matched the calm she now seemed to carry in public, the way people sometimes find steadiness after a storm. Her testimony focused not on policy but on consequence, the way a family's future could be altered in a single night by a misread label, and the way a single person's willingness to speak changed that possible future into a continuing one. The council member who had raised questions in response to the clip listened, as did representatives from the hospital, and something like accountability began to coagulate out the fog. Under mounting public pressure, and after a week of internal meetings that felt to many like shadowboxing, the hospital announced a partial reversal.
The suspension would be lifted, they said, and they promised a review of reporting channels and additional training on safe, anonymous ways for non-clinical staff to raise concerns. They stopped short of an apology in public, but they did send a personal note of acknowledgement to Carlos, along with an offer to meet with Human Resources to discuss ways to formally recognize his report as a good faith safety intervention. It was careful language still, but it was a pivot in tone. For Carlos, the letter was a hand extended, but a hand that still smelled faintly of protocol. When the suspension was lifted, he returned to corridors he had known for years with a complicated heart. Some staff greeted him with warm eyes and an easy nod. Others seemed to shrink away. There was still an undercurrent of irritation among those who feared the institutional precedent. But a day at a time, people who had once looked past him now paused to say thank you. The patient from room 406 and his daughter came by with a small bouquet and a note. The patient's hand trembled as he gripped Carlos's. Time had taken hold of him, and the squeeze was truthful, not theatrical. The daughter did not make a speech. She placed the bouquet in the janitor's cart's little storage pocket, as if the flowers were a token, something to be kept in the place where the work happened. A small ceremony followed, more modest than the press had hoped for, and more meaningful than any headline could convey. The hospital arranged a short event in the staff lounge, where the administration acknowledged the risk that had been averted. A manager spoke of policy and of systems. A few nurses spoke of strain and of the thinness of margins on busy nights. The patient's daughter spoke of gratitude. She smiled at Carlos, and then in the corner, a camera recorded the moment as if to keep a record that a human had been seen. A coin-sized lapel pin was given to him, simple metal with the hospital's insignia, a gesture the administration could comfortably make. It was not a medal, but he pinned it to the front pocket of his uniform as if it was a small star, and it glinted in the fluorescent light. The story did not end there. The crowdfunding surplus and a modest grant from a community organization together became seed money. Carlos decided not to spend all of it on his own storefront. Instead, he leased a tiny space 2 blocks from the hospital, a room with a dented sign and a floor that needed fixing. He called the place Lou's Cafe, Light Cafe, because light in his mind had been both literal and metaphorical in the nights he had worked. He drew a simple menu, coffee, empanadas, and a few sandwiches. He planned quietly for the nights he would keep aside to feed hospital staff for free. Opening day arrived in the kind of rain that made the city gleam.
A small crowd gathered. Neighbors and hospital staff, the patient and his daughter, the nurse who had recorded the clip, a few reporters, and a man from the neighborhood nonprofit who helped Carlos keep the books. They cut a ribbon, thin and a little wrinkled, and the space filled quickly with the smell of coffee and the warmth of an oven. Carlos worked the counter with hands that knew utility, pouring, pressing, counting change. He felt a fatigue that wasn't physical alone, but also felt like the exhaustion of someone who had been seen and weighed and made public. Yet there was a joy braided through it, small and steady. He greeted nurses who arrived after long shifts. He pressed hot cups into their palms and watched the muscles around their eyes unclench. Lou's Cafe became, in short order, what he had hoped. More than a business, it was a small place of repair. Once a week he announced a night shift meal, free soup and coffee for anyone who wore a hospital badge. He hired a friend from the building who had done kitchen work, and a young man who used to help in the hospital's laundry. Carlos's sister sent recipes from home, and sometimes worked behind the counter when she visited. The storefront did not make him rich. It paid rent and let him sleep in a bed that felt more like belonging than before. It gave him a role shaped by his life's small truths: hospitality, care, and a willingness to notice. The hospital, for its part, instituted trainings that featured anonymous reporting tools and an emphasis on speaking up for safety. Employees were told that any good faith flagging would be protected and investigated without punitive measures for the person who raised it. Whether policy would always match practice is a longer question. Institutions change slowly, and habits are stubborn. But the conversation had shifted. There were new posters in the staff lounge reminding teams that safety required everyone's attention. The nurse who had made the mistake returned to work after a period of leave. Her path forward was not without complication, but she and Carlos shared a small private handshake in the break room one evening, a gesture that said acknowledgement without grandness. With visibility came offers that felt both flattering and awkward. He was invited to speak at a high school assembly about dignity in work and at a local civic event about worker protections. He did so not to claim heroism, but to spread the idea that invisible labor is not valueless. He told teenagers that their hands, calloused, fresh, untried, would someday carry others' burdens in ways that mattered more than applause. He told a crowd at a civic center that courage is not a title, it is a choice you make when no one is watching. Not everyone was ready to accept the tidy arc of rehabilitation.
A few months later, a group of hospital staff quietly organized a petition arguing that the institution had been forced by public pressure into policy changes and that sudden reversals could have complicated effects on clinical workflow. The debate was complex, technical sounding to outsiders, and full of earnest worry. Carlos did not engage publicly with the dissenters. He believed the work of change was often quieter than a headline. He went to meetings, he listened, and when he could, he tried to be the person who built bridges rather than walls. He learned the stilted language of committees and the patient arithmetic of scheduling. His life, too, shifted in quieter ways. He had taken to sleeping with the photograph of his mother and sisters by his bedside, and, when the stress threatened to unhinge him, he would read the names on the back of receipts that friends had tucked into the fundraiser page as notes. He paid his sister's tuition for a semester in full and bought a new set of pans for his mother when she visited. Those acts were small restorations that felt like keeping his own side of a contract he had always had with family. He sent money back to Guatemala with a regularity that made it less of a sacrifice and more of a habit of care. There were also nights when he felt exposed. Being visible meant that small slights cut deeper. A commenter online accused him of grandstanding. A tabloid tried to paint him as an attention seeker. Those pains were sharper for being unnecessary. He learned to step away from the noise and to let the steady work of the cafe and the hospital grounds be the judge of his character. Over time, the noise quieted, and his days were defined less by viral cycles and more by the rhythm of an espresso machine and the steady procession of people seeking a warm cup. On a gray afternoon that felt like a folding of seasons, the city decided to honor unsung community heroes with a small ceremony at the municipal hall. Carlos was invited, and despite his discomfort at being celebrated, he accepted. He stood on a narrow stage under soft lights and watched the mayor present him with a modest plaque. The mayor's speech was careful, about civic gratitude and community resilience, but when the mayor reached out and offered Carlos a handshake, the gesture felt more meaningful than any formal speech. The patient's daughter was in the front row, a small smile playing across her face, and she mouthed the words, "Thank you," as if speaking for the nights of sleep she had once missed. After the ceremony, as people congratulated him, a woman approached, an older janitor from another hospital, and simply squeezed his shoulder. Her expression was a complicated map of pride and wariness. "You made us visible," she said in Spanish, and the phrase landed like a small benediction. Carlos did not know if he had made anyone visible. He knew only that the moment had opened a door that would remain open in small, practical ways.
He had not been seeking recognition, but he had accepted it as a tool, a way to lift the conversation for those who, like him, understood the world in details. In the months that followed, Lou's Cafe held monthly night shift nights, where hospital staff could come for free meals and casual conversation. The cafe also sponsored a small scholarship for children of custodial staff to help with school fees. These were practical gestures, the kind that do not make big headlines, but change nights and classrooms and grocery lists. Carlos organized a small plaque near the cafe door that read, simply and in Spanish and English,
for those who keep the world going when the rest of us sleep. It was not a proclamation of personal glory so much as an invitation to remember. His relationship with the hospital slowly normalized. The nurse who had recorded the original clip remained employed, now working in a different wing with a more manageable schedule. They developed a quiet mutual respect, an acknowledgement that their lives had become entangled by a dangerous mix-up and a better outcome. Some staff remained wary, others warmed to the fact that policy had shifted, even if the details still needed ironing out. Change, they all learned, is iterative. Carlos's dream of a small storefront had, in a way, expanded into a horizon that reached beyond him. He hired a former night porter as a weekend dishwasher and a young woman who had been in the hospital's laundry as a part-time pastry assistant. He offered flexible hours to night workers, recognizing what it meant to be awake when others slept. He kept the price of a cup of coffee modest and refused to let commercialization of the story turn the cafe into a spectacle. It remained modest, practical, neighborly. There were small, private miracles. The patient from room 406 regained a measure of health and would, on occasion, stop by the cafe with his daughter to buy a pastry. They did not make a spectacle of it. They sat quietly and ate, the way people recover privacy in public. Time, which is both forgiving and eroding, smoothed some edges and left others intact. Carlos still woke for shifts with a lump of fatigue lodged near his ribs sometimes. He began to go to a community support group for night shift workers, where he would speak rarely but listen often. The group taught him that acts of courage are seldom free of cost, that there are emotional debts that need paying, and that community is the currency that sometimes does the paying. He learned to take rest when he needed it, and to let others take the lead when he had to be absent. The cafe became a modest hub for conversations about labor, dignity, and care. Sometimes a city official would drop by. Sometimes a student would come to interview him about the ethics of speaking up. He answered consistently, "See the people who are unseen. Give them space to speak. Make systems that do not force individuals to choose between safety and livelihood."
His voice, quiet and practical, found a rhythm that the city began to take seriously. Not everyone agreed with him, but fewer people dismissed the subject as trivial. Years later, the plaque the city had given him would be joined by another small marker, placed at community request near a nurse's station at the hospital. It did not single out an individual so much as it served as a collective reminder. To every hand that notices, to every voice that speaks, we protect what matters together. The marker was a subtle change, but institutional symbols have power. They tell new employees that the culture of a place is not immutable. If you walked into the cafe on an ordinary weekday, you would see Carlos wiping a counter, a woman from security sitting in the corner with a crossword, a nurse reading a chart over a shared scone. You would see on a small shelf the photograph of his mother and sisters, and a stack of notebooks where customers left brief thank you notes. You would see a tiny tin by the register where people could donate to the scholarship fund. The scene was domestic and tender, the kind of everyday beauty that does not announce itself loudly. He was not a flawless man. There were nights when old fears surfaced, when he would wake from a dream and sit in the dark, heart pounding as if the fluorescent lights still hummed in his bones. There were moments he regretted some of his choices that led to public visibility. He sometimes missed the private dignity of work that goes unremarked. But he also felt, in the long arc, a sense of rightness. He had honored the voice his mother had taught him to listen to. He had used public attention to build something small and enduring. He had, in ways he never sought, helped shape conversation about safety and the dignity of labor. Once, near closing time on an ordinary Tuesday, a young janitor pushed his cart past the cafe and paused at the window. He looked at the light inside as if it were a harbor. Carlos saw him and opened the door. The young man stepped inside, shy, and asked if there might be any free food tonight. Carlos handed him a bowl of soup and a loaf of warm bread, and as they sat, asked about his work. The young man spoke about how sometimes supervisors ignored them, and how he was afraid to speak up when something seemed wrong. Carlos listened and told him simply a story about a night and a misread label and a choice. "You will be nervous," Carlos said, in the same Spanish his mother had taught him, "and that's okay. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to act anyway." The young man nodded. It was not a lecture. It was a passing of a small tool, a story that could be held in the throat when the moment asked for it. Years after that rainy Tuesday, people still spoke of the night in fragments, a clip here, a news piece there, the phrase "janitor stops mix-up," used like an epithet in other stories.
But the more durable thing was not the clip. It was the slow, stubborn change in how a few institutions treated the people who worked in their margins. Policies were adjusted, reporting channels improved, and a tiny cafe continued to feed the night. One evening, as the cafe closed and the city settled into its own low humming, Carlos walked home with his fatherly fatigue settled into his shoulders. He passed by the hospital and paused to look at a small new marker near the entrance, just a modest plaque with words both simple and true. He thought of his mother's hands, the photograph he had carried for years, and the quiet life that had grown into something public and neighborly. He thought of the patient who had lived, of the nurse who had been frightened, of the young workers who now felt a little more license to speak up. He had, for a time, been invisible. That invisibility had been the texture of his labor, the way people moved around him as if he were scenery. But one night his attention broke a pattern, and the world responded in a messy, bewildering human way. The story that had begun with a narrow, urgent choice had unfurled into a broader change. It had not erased hardship, but it had created an opening where dignity might fit. As he walked into Lou's cafe to close for the night, he ran a cloth over the counter slowly, the same motion he had used for years when the hospital corridors were his domain. The cloth caught crumbs and left a clean surface. The act was both practical and symbolic. The world keeps being messy. Cleaning is a form of steadiness. He put on a small radio for the curtailed overnight news and made a pot of decaf. A nurse stuck her head in the door and smiled, tired but grateful. He poured her a cup and set it in front of her without charging. She laughed and said, "You're a good man, Carlos." He shrugged, embarrassed by the phrase. "I try," he said. Outside, the city breathed. Inside, the light glowed. Invisible things, small acts of attention, the dignity of honest labor, were, if not always honored, then at least remembered in some places. He thought of the hundreds of hands that kept hospitals running, and the countless small decisions those hands made every night. He thought of his mother's phrase again, "When you see something wrong, tell the truth." He had done that, and the consequence had been a life continued, a community stirred, and a small storefront that fed people at all hours. Before locking up, he placed a small photograph on the counter where customers sometimes left notes, a photograph of the night he had stood in the corridor, less than perfect, grainy. He did not put it there to boast. He put it there so people could see that ordinary men sometimes make extraordinary choices when faced with simple moral questions. He wanted the image to be a prompt more than a trophy.
If there is a moral to the story, it is uncomplicated and persistent. We pass by invisible people every day. Janitors, porters, cooks, caretakers, and those people carry within them the capacity to change outcomes by noticing. Courage is not always loud. Often it is just the small act of refusing to look away. He locked the door and stepped into the night, his breath misting in the cool air. Somewhere a siren threaded through the city. Somewhere else, a woman hummed the same hymn she had hummed months before at a bedside that had been spared. Carlos pulled his jacket tire and walked toward home, toward the photograph in his wallet, toward the small life he had built out of quiet choices. He would open early the next morning because people would come and need a hot coffee before the shift that never sleeps. He would continue to notice. He would continue to speak, when needed, with the humble force of someone who believed that seeing people mattered. If you remember one thing from this story, remember the ordinariness of the moment that changed everything: a man pushing a cart, a misread label, and a choice to interrupt the flow. That is often how history keeps its small ledger, one attentive heartbeat at a time. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear why invisible work matters. Like and subscribe for more stories of ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Production note: this script adapts the emotional and narrative DNA of an earlier account to portray Carlos Menddees as a hospital janitor who prevented a fatal medical error. Elements have been dramatized to honor the title and themes while respecting privacy and avoiding technical, medical, or legal specifics.